The room was still, not the calm kind of stillness, but the kind that hums with unspoken tension. Cameras hung like quiet witnesses above a sea of faces. Lawmakers, aides, journalists, all waiting for another predictable round of speeches. The flags behind the podium hardly stirred. The air felt ceremonial, heavy, scripted. Then Jasmine Crockett took the floor. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone, but her voice, when it came, carried something raw. Not politics, not partisanship, but heart. To the teachers, she began, who show up even when the world forgets to thank them. A few heads lifted. Some eyes flickered. To those who buy their own supplies, stay after hours, and remind our children that their dreams are valid. Her tone softened, breaking through the monotony. For a moment, it wasn't Congress speaking. It was America remembering its conscience. But across the room, many faces stayed frozen. Phones glowed in palms. Pens clicked. A quiet cough broke the rhythm. Gratitude, it seemed, was too humble an emotion for the powerful to perform. Then came the sound. Small, unexpected, clear. One man stood. Kash Patel. His suit caught the light as he rose from his seat, eyes locked on the speaker. His hands came together, slow and deliberate. Clap, clap, the sound echoed. Every head turned. Cameras zoomed. Some frowned, others whispered. And then, as if struck by an invisible cue, a few more joined. Clap, clap, clap. A ripple became a rhythm. The hall filled with applause that rose like a tide, reluctant at first, then roaring. Crockett paused mid-sentence, emotion flickering across her face. For one fleeting second, the chamber didn't look divided. It looked human. Teachers watching from afar would later say it felt like someone had finally heard them. But in that very instant, behind the applause, something deeper was stirring. The applause wasn't just for educators. It was for courage, for sincerity, for something Washington rarely witnessed anymore. Authenticity. And as Patel's hands came together one last time, his expression unreadable, the moment shifted from tribute to tremor, a spark waiting to ignite. But what he did next turned a polite tribute into a national headline. Before that applause swept through the hall, the moment had begun as something simple, a tribute easily lost in a day of scripted speeches and partisan jabs. Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to score points. She'd come to remind the room of something older, purer, and nearly forgotten. Her words were meant to lift up the people who carried the nation quietly on their backs, the teachers who fought every day not for profit, but for possibility. In the weeks leading up to that hearing, the debate over America's classrooms had turned bitter. School boards had become battlegrounds. Lessons turned into headlines. The talk shows buzzed about curriculum wars, history books, and funding fights that left classrooms divided by ideology instead of enriched by learning. Parents were angry, politicians were louder, and teachers, the very heart of the system, were burning out under the weight of culture wars they never asked for. Crockett's tribute was meant to pierce through that noise. Her team had drafted nothing dramatic. No slogans, no partisan sting, just gratitude. To every educator still showing up, she said in her opening line, you are the reason the idea of America still breathes. It was supposed to be the kind of statement that no one could argue with. A bridge built out of respect, but this was Washington. Bridges here didn't last long. Even before Patel's applause, the tension in the room carried an undercurrent of disbelief. Some smirked, whispering that her tribute was performative, a camera grab for viral empathy. Others simply tuned out, too tired to care. In an era when compassion was often weaponized, sincerity had become suspicious. And Crockett, young, unapologetically outspoken black, and female, had long learned that even gratitude could be seen as rebellion if it came from the wrong mouth. Meanwhile, Kash Patel, seated quietly on the opposite side of the aisle, watched her speech unfold with a kind of focus that didn't fit the usual choreography of politics. To many, he was a loyal, conservative figure, someone expected to remain in silent opposition. But something in Crockett's tone, her nod to educators, her reference to her mother's decades in public schools, cut through those assumptions. When he stood, it wasn't premeditated. It was instinct, the muscle memory of someone who still believed that respect transcends party lines. Yet even as the applause swelled, The first camera angle hit social media. Tweets popped up. Was this planned? A stunt? Optics? The echo chamber spun faster than the moment could breathe. Crockett's supporters framed it as unity. Critics framed it as theater. News sites ran still images of Patel standing alone. Headlines split between praise and suspicion. But none of them captured the quiet truth, that the gesture had been real. One person had chosen respect over routine, and the room didn't quite know what to do with it. The applause had ended, but the questions had just begun. What did it mean when two political opposites found common ground? Not in policy, but in humanity. Could Washington even recognize decency without doubting it first? The moment was over in seconds, yet it lingered like an echo. A test, a mirror, a challenge. Because deep down, everyone watching sensed it. The applause had opened a door, and what came through would shake the image of political loyalty to its core. Viewers didn't yet realize that this single standing ovation would expose America's political double standards. In every story about courage, there's always the counterweight, the quiet resistance of pride. The moment Jasmine Crockett spoke, there were faces already rehearsed to remain still. Across the room they sat polished and unflinching. The veteran politicians, the strategists of optics, the masters of the non-reaction. They knew the rules. Never give your opponent a headline, never show emotion that can't be spun. And so when the tribute to educators began, they folded their arms and waited for it to pass, as if decency itself were an inconvenience. One senator, sharp suit, practiced smirk, leaned back, whispering to an aide without ever looking up. Another scrolled through notes, pretending to be busy. They'd already decided what the moment would be before it even began. Another emotional plea from the left. In their world, empathy was strategy, not sincerity. To stand, to clap, to feel. That was weakness. It wasn't that they hated teachers. They just didn't trust the motive. Everything in Washington was theater, they believed, and every actor performed for a side. Their armor was indifference. Their weapon was control. If the public saw them unmoved, it meant they hadn't surrendered the narrative, and yet behind that indifference was exhaustion. The Capitol had long since blurred the lines between principle and performance. Cameras had turned politicians into characters, debates into scripts, compassion into content. When Crockett spoke of educators buying their own supplies, some of those who stayed seated weren't cruel, just numb. They'd heard it all before. Every appeal, every emotional pitch, every call for unity, all swallowed by the same gridlock that defined their careers. Still, the optics mattered. The moment Patel stood, eyes darted. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One aide whispered, "Sit tight, cameras are rolling." The decision to remain seated wasn't spontaneous. It was survival. If one stood, others would ask why. If one clapped, it could be read as crossing lines. The hierarchy of hesitation ruled the room. Outside, in the echo chamber of commentary, the cynicism spread faster than the applause. Cable panels cut the clip within hours. One pundit smirked as he leaned toward the camera. "Let's not pretend this was about teachers," he said. "It was a branding moment, for both of them." His co-host nodded, eager to dissect every gesture. "Look at Patel," she added. "Calculated. He knows the optics. Everyone's chasing a viral moral moment these days." The audience watching from home nodded along, not out of belief, but fatigue. It was easier to assume everyone was faking than to hope anyone was real. That was the real villainy of the age. Not corruption, not malice, but moral exhaustion. Decency had become suspect. Gratitude looked like theater. The more sincere a gesture appeared, the faster people tried to decode the agenda behind it. And in that fog of distrust, those who refused to stand felt justified. To them, restraint was integrity. They believed they were protecting politics from sentimentality. "We're not here for applause lines," one congressman later told a reporter. "We're here to govern," but his words rang hollow, especially when governance itself had become a performance of deflection. Meanwhile, in the corners of the internet, the clip fractured into 1,000 interpretations. Some saw it as unity, others as manipulation. Comment sections overflowed with certainty from people who hadn't even watched the full minute. Each viewer projected their own exhaustion onto the screen. In a culture addicted to outrage, Neutrality masqueraded as wisdom. Inside the chamber, the same still faces told the same story. Too proud to stand, too self-aware to be human. Cameras caught everything. The side-eye glances, the faint smirks, the stiffness of those terrified of sincerity. Even in applause they heard risk. Even in silence they found safety. It was a portrait of a city that had forgotten how to feel. Once politics had been theater of ideas. Now it was a choreography of control. Empathy, when shown, was dissected until it bled meaning, and those who hid behind blank expressions mistook apathy for strength. It was a portrait of a city that had forgotten how to feel. Once politics had been theater of ideas. Now it was a choreography of control. Empathy, when shown, was dissected until it bled meaning, and those who hid behind blank expressions mistook apathy for strength. But every narrative of cynicism eventually meets its contradiction, and sometimes that contradiction doesn't come with speeches or slogans, just a single, human impulse that refuses to conform. Because while the room sank into its own calculated stillness, one man's quiet act would shatter that cynicism in real time. Before that moment in the chamber, before the cameras caught his quiet applause, Kash Patel had already lived 100 versions of himself in the public eye. Lawyer, investigator, national security official, target of controversy, son of immigrants. Each title had its own weight, but behind all of them was something simpler. A man raised to respect those who teach. His story began far from the marble floors of Washington, in a small American town where his parents had arrived with little more than faith and persistence. They were immigrants chasing the version of America they'd read about but never seen, one built on work, not privilege. His mother taught at a local school, often coming home with chalk dust on her sleeves and stories of students who couldn't afford notebooks. His father worked in manufacturing, hands scarred but steady, telling his children, "Education is the only currency that never loses value." Those words stuck. As a boy, Kash watched his mother correct papers under the dim kitchen light long after dinner was done. He learned that teaching wasn't just a profession. It was a form of service, a small daily act of nation-building. And though his own path would take him into the machinery of law and politics, that early reverence for educators never left him. When he entered public service, it wasn't through the glamorous door. He started quietly behind the scenes, working cases that required precision more than spotlight. He was known for reading every line twice, questioning assumptions and refusing to echo what others said just to fit in. Over time, those traits became his identity, both his armor and his curse. In Washington, independent thought was risky currency. His work in national security earned him both praise and suspicion. Supporters saw courage, a man unafraid to confront broken systems. Critics saw calculation. The truth was somewhere in between. Patel didn't play for approval. He played for clarity. He once said in an interview, "My loyalty isn't to comfort. It's to what's right, even when it hurts." That quote followed him for years, sometimes twisted, sometimes honored, always remembered. The backlash came with time. He'd been called loyalist, radical, hero, enabler. The labels changed depending on who was shouting. The noise around him grew so constant that it nearly drowned out who he really was. A man who still called his former teachers on holidays, who sent thank you notes in his own handwriting, who believed that the best kind of power was the kind you didn't need to announce. And yet, Washington had a way of turning even decency into spectacle. Each time Patel spoke his truth, someone tried to reframe it. Each time he stayed silent, others filled in the blanks. Over the years, he'd learned to stop defending his image and start protecting his integrity. "You can't control what they say," his father told him once, "but you can control what you stand for." That lesson would echo years later in that congressional chamber. When Jasmine Crockett began her tribute to educators, Patel didn't see a political moment. He saw his mother, her hands rough from grading papers, her patience endless even when no one thanked her. He saw his father saving for his children's school books, insisting that the classroom was sacred ground. As she spoke, those memories collided with the sterile quiet of Washington, a place that forgot to honor simple service. He felt something stir. It wasn't strategy or optics. It was instinct. the reflex of a man raised to recognize sincerity when it walks into a room. For a second, he didn't think about how it would look or who might roll their eyes. He didn't calculate party lines or media angles. He just remembered the lessons that built him. When someone honors teachers, you stand. People often misunderstood him. His calm mistaken for calculation, his directness for defiance. But beneath it all was humility, not arrogance. He had spent a lifetime watching the cost of silence, especially when decency went unacknowledged. He knew that if good people waited for permission to do the right thing, the moment would always pass. And so, as Crockett spoke, he made a decision that didn't belong to either side of the aisle. It belonged to the son of a teacher who believed that gratitude was never partisan. To him, standing was not an endorsement. It was a thank you, one long overdue. That single gesture would become the most human act of his political life. It wasn't loud, but it resonated louder than any speech he'd ever given. For once, he wasn't the strategist, the analyst, or the headline. He was just a man reclaiming his narrative through grace. Because in a city where silence often signals loyalty and applause can be mistaken for betrayal, Patel chose something far braver: authenticity. And that's why, when the room went silent, his instincts spoke louder than politics. The speech itself had been short, not a rallying cry, not a speech crafted to dominate headlines, just words from the heart. Jasmine Crockett's voice carried the kind of tremor that only truth can give. Every teacher who shows up, even when the classroom feels forgotten, is keeping the soul of this country alive, she said. Her tone wavered, then steadied. They are the ones who teach us to listen before we argue, to think before we divide. For a moment, it felt like the room might soften. But the spell broke as quickly as it formed. A senator near the front leaned over to check his phone. Another whispered something to a staffer, grinning. The camera lens caught it. The small smirk, the barely disguised impatience. Somewhere behind them, a sigh of boredom escaped into the microphone feed. The stillness wasn't reverence. It was dismissal. Crockett continued, her cadence gathering force, unaware that the gallery had already begun to drift. My mother was a public school teacher for 30 years, she said. And I watched her fight for children others had written off, kids who just needed someone to tell them they mattered. She paused, just long enough for the room to breathe, or fail to. Not a single sound followed, no nods, no gestures, just a hollow stillness that swallowed her sincerity whole. That's when Patel moved. It wasn't grand or rehearsed. He didn't glance around for validation. He simply rose. His chair creaked against the marble floor, cutting through the silence like a match struck in a cave. Then came the sound of the first deliberate clap. It echoed once, then again, breaking through the indifference like a heartbeat restarting a flat line. The heads turned, cameras tilted. A few aides looked panicked, unsure whether to follow or freeze. And still, Patel kept clapping. Not faster, not louder, but with a rhythm that felt like principle itself had found a pulse. Jasmine Crockett looked up mid-sentence. Her voice faltered for half a breath, then steadied with visible emotion. She didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened. That silent recognition between two people who understood what courage costs. Others joined, reluctantly at first. The sound spread unevenly, pockets of applause erupting from corners where empathy momentarily outweighed fear of judgment. A few lawmakers stood. Most didn't, but the energy had shifted. The hall no longer felt sterile. It pulsed, faintly, awkwardly, beautifully, with humanity. Outside the frame, journalists exchanged quick glances. Pens stopped scratching. Cameras zoomed tighter. "What's he doing?" one reporter whispered. "Patel's standing." Another muttered disbelief creeping into her tone. They weren't sure whether they were witnessing sincerity or strategy, and that uncertainty made it news. For Patel, it was neither. It was conscience, pure and unfiltered, the kind that doesn't wait for consensus. He didn't know or care what narrative would be built around it. He wasn't thinking of the pundits or the hashtags. He was thinking of his mother, the teacher who once told him, "When someone thanks you for your service, always thank them back, because gratitude is circular." The applause grew louder now, rolling through the chamber like a wave that refused to die down. Even the unmoved began to look uneasy. Cameras captured every angle. Crockett, standing at the podium, humbled, Patel resolute. The faces around them caught between pride and confusion. To the viewers at home, it looked like unity. To those in the room, it felt like disruption. The script of indifference had been broken, and no one knew what to do with authenticity once it stepped onto the stage. As the clapping finally faded, silence returned. Heavier this time, loaded with the awareness that something unscripted had just occurred. Patel slowly sat down, expression steady, while Crockett drew in a deep breath and whispered her final words. To every teacher who still believes in their students, we see you, we thank you, we need you. There was no mistaking it now. The speech had transformed. What began as a gentle tribute had turned into a reckoning. The nation would soon argue over what it meant, but in that chamber, one truth lingered. Sincerity had finally made Washington uncomfortable, and what came after his applause was something no one in that chamber expected. At first it was just applause. A sound so ordinary, yet so out of place in a hall trained to resist sincerity. One pair of hands, then two, then dozens. The ripple spread like a current no one could contain. Within seconds, what began as an isolated gesture had turned into something electric, defiant, cleansing, undeniable. Jasmine Crockett stood frozen for a heartbeat, eyes wide, almost disbelieving. She had braced herself for polite nods, for the kind of lukewarm civility Washington performs so well. But this was different. Kash Patel, the man many had dismissed as a partisan warrior, now stood as the lone figure who had dared to respond to her humanity with humanity. She blinked, just once, and then did something that wasn't in her speech. She closed her folder. The mic picked up the soft snap of the cover, as if it were the strike of a gavel. The room, now on its feet, felt suspended in something unspoken. Across the chamber, old rivals hesitated before standing. One senior lawmaker adjusted his tie, clearly torn between optics and conscience. A younger representative beside him stood anyway, the movement awkward, almost reluctant. Then another, and another. Camera flashes strobed across the faces. Disbelief, curiosity, even envy. For a fleeting moment, the usual mask slipped. The narration, if there were one, would have said it like this. For one breath, Washington forgot who was red or blue. That breath lasted longer than anyone expected. Crockett finally nodded, not as a politician thanking applause, but as a person acknowledging something far more sacred. She looked toward Patel. Their eyes met. Two people who shared nothing on paper but everything in principle. The gratitude between them didn't need words. It was visible in the stillness. It was loud without sound. Then came the cutaways, the televised reaction shots America would replay again and again. The anchor covering the hearing paused mid-sentence, eyes darting toward her producer. On cable networks, control room directors barked for camera 2, camera 5, camera 8. Every outlet knew instinctively. This was the moment. Clips hit social media within minutes. A single freeze frame. Patel on his feet, palms together in mid-clap, a look of quiet conviction on his face. The caption wrote itself. Patel stands. The hashtag took off like wildfire. Within an hour, it was trending in D.C., then nationwide. Finally, dignity in politics, one user posted. When decency is revolutionary, we are in trouble. But I'll take it, another wrote. One tweet simply read, he stood. Everyone else just watched. The applause in the chamber still hadn't completely died down. Crockett leaned slightly toward the mic, her voice steady but filled with emotion. To every teacher watching, she said softly, this moment belongs to you. And the hall erupted again. Louder this time, less choreographed. Reporters who'd come expecting a quiet tribute were now scrambling to find angles. Some whispered that Patel's move had been calculated, a shrewd bid to rebrand himself in a polarized climate. Others insisted it was spontaneous, born from something rare. Sincerity unfiltered by ambition. Whatever it was, it worked. A CNN chyron flashed, Kash Patel stands alone, and America takes notice. Fox countered with, political theater or principle? Patel ignites debate. MSNBC simply went poetic. In a divided room, one stands. The media storm had begun, but inside that marble chamber, none of it mattered yet. The energy was still raw, still real. You could feel it in the air. that uneasy recognition that decency, when witnessed, carries more force than outrage. Patel sat down at last, exhaling quietly. For a second he looked older, humbled, aware of what he'd just unleashed. Beside him, a fellow representative whispered, "That's gonna blow up online." He didn't answer. He just watched Crockett, who now stood taller at the podium. Her poise renewed. "Sometimes," she said, her voice trembling again, "all it takes is one person to stand so others remember how." It wasn't a line from her notes. It was something born right there in the glow of cameras and conscience. The chamber fell still again. Not the cold silence from before, but one thick with awareness. People would later argue about its meaning, twist it into narratives, break it down in partisan panels. But in that moment, the air itself felt changed. For one fragile minute, Washington had witnessed grace. Outside the Capitol, the story already had legs. Commentators raced to claim its moral territory. Some hailed Patel as a unifier in a fractured time. Others mocked him as a performer. The divide, once invisible, began to hum again, amplified, sharpened. On TikTok, edits rolled out within hours. Slow-motion clips of Patel standing, Crockett blinking back emotion, music swelling underneath. Heroism in real time, one title read. The internet did what it always does, turned a moment into a movement into a meme. By nightfall, the numbers told the story. Millions of views, thousands of reposts, calls for interviews. The digital applause had outlasted the real one. And yet, beneath all the noise, something quieter was happening. A discomfort spreading among those who had stayed seated. The ones whose blank expressions were now viral. The ones who had dismissed Crockett's tribute as political theater and found themselves cast as the villains of authenticity. In private texts and hushed hallways, they were already plotting damage control. "We'll say it was a misunderstanding," one aide suggested. "We'll pivot to the economy," another said. But deep down, they knew, you can't pivot from truth because truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. Back in the chamber, as the applause finally faded for good, Crockett glanced once more toward Patel. This time, her expression wasn't gratitude, it was acknowledgement. Two players in different parties, but in that instant, on the same side of decency. The cameras zoomed out. The wide shot captured it all. Two figures, small against the vast architecture of power, but somehow larger than the system surrounding them. The moment lingered like an echo that refused to fade. And then the sound cut. The mic lights went dark. The broadcast feed ended. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, waiting, ominous. Because Washington, after all, has a way of punishing authenticity. And though the world saw applause, those inside knew the truth. Moments like these don't go unchallenged. The ripple that had begun with a single clap was about to collide with the machinery of politics, the egos, the narratives, the spin. The world had witnessed a rare flash of integrity. But when the cameras stopped rolling, that's when the real storm began. By morning, the moment had already transformed into a movement. What began as a spark in a sterile congressional hall had set the digital world ablaze. The clip of Kash Patel standing, that single unguarded act of respect, was now looping endlessly across timelines and televisions. The internet had decided it wasn't just a story. It was a symbol. Teachers shared it first. Videos appeared of classrooms gathered around computer screens, students watching the 30-second clip in silence. One teacher in Ohio wrote, "For once they're clapping for us." A veteran posted a simple comment beneath the video. "That's the America I fought for." Parents chimed in next, their gratitude carrying both hope and exhaustion. "My kids' teachers show up every day, no matter who's in office." "Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Kash." Within hours, the moment had become uncontainable. Cable news replayed it on a loop, the same few seconds dissected by every network with their chosen tone. Reverent, skeptical, politicized. Analysts froze the footage frame by frame. Patel's slow rise, Crockett's pause, the ripple of applause. "Look here," one commentator said, circling Patel's expression with digital ink. "He's not performing, that's conviction." Another countered, "Or calculation. Don't underestimate political theater." The arguments burned through the day, each side desperate to claim ownership of something that didn't belong to either. On talk radio, hosts debated whether decency could ever be apolitical again. On YouTube, reaction videos exploded, thumbnails flashing bold titles like "A Rare Moment of Humanity in D.C." And was this staged? Then came the celebrities. A-list actors reposted the clip with captions like "Hope still exists." A country singer tweeted, "Didn't expect to agree with either of them." But that hit. Even a notoriously cynical late-night host paused his monologue to play the full video without interruption. No jokes, no irony, just silence as the clip ended, followed by a single line. Imagine if this was normal. For one day, the outrage economy took a breath. The public's reaction split along unfamiliar lines. It wasn't left versus right anymore. It was cynics versus believers. The believers saw a glimpse of what the country could be when humanity wins over headlines. The cynics rolled their eyes, dismissing it as a viral illusion, the kind that burns bright before fading into the next scandal cycle. But for many it felt like a reprieve, a reminder that respect hadn't gone extinct, only dormant. Teachers began using the clip as a morning discussion prompt. What does it mean to stand for something? Students wrote essays about courage and kindness. A civics teacher in California said, "For the first time, my kids wanted to talk about Congress without groaning. Even those usually numb to politics felt something shift." Across communities divided by years of distrust, people found themselves sharing the same video. Some inspired, others curious, but all strangely moved. It wasn't policy. It wasn't power. It was decency, raw, visible, and rare. In editorial rooms, editors scrambled to shape the story. Headlines competed for emotion. A standing ovation heard across America. A Congress divided, united by applause. Patel and Crockett redefine respect. Each tried to capture the alchemy of the moment, but none quite did. Because what had happened wasn't about ideology. It was about recognition. Two human beings had reminded the country what it felt like to listen without calculation. Still, politics has a way of reclaiming purity. The spin doctors got to work. Anonymous sources whispered about timing coordination. Commentators speculated that Patel's team had anticipated a moment. The familiar cycle returned: suspicion, polarization, fatigue. But this time, the skepticism felt thinner, like a reflex the nation no longer fully believed in. Meanwhile, Patel and Crockett stayed silent. No victory laps, no viral quotes. Just stillness. And maybe that was what made it linger, their refusal to explain the unexplainable. In living rooms across the country, families replayed the moment together. Parents pointed to the screen and said, "That's how you show respect." Teenagers scrolled through memes and arguments, but even they seemed to sense something genuine beneath the noise. One post summed it up perfectly. For 30 seconds, we remembered we're on the same team. By evening, the story had traveled beyond politics entirely. Faith leaders referenced it in sermons. Sports teams replayed the clip before games. A muralist in Chicago began sketching the scene. Patel standing, Crockett at the podium. The background blurred into light. And through it all, the conversation kept circling back to the same feeling. Disbelief mixed with pride. The disbelief that something so small could pierce through so much division. The pride that, somehow, it had. The storm of takes and reactions would fade soon enough. It always does. But what lingered wasn't a headline or a hashtag. It was the echo of a truth too simple for politics to contain. That decency, when it appears, still has the power to stop a nation mid-sentence. And yet beyond the noise, the country had witnessed something larger than politics. In the end, it wasn't about applause. It wasn't even about politics. It was about something far older, far quieter, the unspoken code that binds a country when words fail: respect. For all the noise that followed, the moment itself remained pure. Two people standing on opposite sides of a political battlefield had met in the middle, not with policy, not with power, but with grace. Jasmine Crockett's tribute had come from gratitude. Kash Patel's response had come from conscience. Everything else, the hashtags, the headlines, the arguments, were echoes. When the cameras stopped rolling, the question lingered. Why had that moment felt so rare? Maybe because it reminded America of what it was supposed to be. A nation not built on agreement, but on acknowledgement. A place where you could stand for someone else's truth without surrendering your own. Respect transcends ideology. Gratitude transcends color. That's what teachers saw. Across classrooms and staff lounges, they shared the clip like a quiet anthem. That moment, one teacher in Detroit wrote, reminded us why we show up every day, even when nobody claps. Another from rural Kansas said, we don't need parades, we just need to be seen. And somehow 2 politicians, one speaking, one standing, had managed to do just that. The story began to shift from political analysis to moral reflection. Commentators who'd once thrived on outrage now found themselves speaking in softer tones. Maybe this, one pundit said, is what leadership looks like, not grandstanding, but gratitude. The footage took on a second life, shared not for its controversy but its calm. Parents showed it to their kids. Teachers played it before morning announcements. It became a rare kind of viral, one that lifted instead of divided, because that's the secret about decency. It doesn't demand the spotlight. It glows quietly, waiting for someone to notice. And when it does appear, in a standing ovation, a thank you, a single moment of courage, it reminds people that integrity doesn't need a party. It just needs a pulse. For Patel, the applause was never a performance. It was instinct, the kind passed down from a mother who taught respect as a daily ritual. For Crockett, the words were never political theater. They were love letters to the invisible backbone of America, the educators who build futures one lesson at a time. Together, without coordination or calculation, they had given the country a glimpse of what unity sounds like. Not silence, not shouting, but the rhythm of shared humanity. And maybe that's why the moment lingered longer than most. Because it didn't ask people to take sides. It asked them to remember who they were before sides existed. It invited a weary nation to pause, to breathe, to believe, if only for 30 seconds, that empathy was still possible. When history looks back, this moment won't be remembered as a scandal or a soundbite. It will be remembered as a pause, a small shimmering instance where America looked up from its arguments and saw itself reflected in something simple: gratitude. And that's the quiet truth at the heart of it all. The strength of a nation isn't measured by how loud it argues, but by how softly it listens. So when Kash Patel stood and Jasmine Crockett spoke, something larger than both of them stood too. It was the spirit of decency, scarred, tired, but still standing. And if there's a moral to take from that day, it's this: courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stands up and claps, because in the end, dignity, not dominance, is what defines America's truest form of strength. It began with silence, the kind that fills rooms built for speeches but starved for sincerity. Then came a voice, trembling with conviction. And then, one man stood. That simple gesture, Kash Patel rising to honor Jasmine Crockett's tribute, became something larger than either of them could have planned. A wave of applause swept the hall, and then somehow swept across the nation. It wasn't about who was right or left, who won or lost. It was about what still connects us when politics forgets how to feel: respect. The cameras captured the clapping, but what lingered wasn't the sound. It was the silence before it. The courage it takes to break that silence. The reminder that decency doesn't need to trend to matter. Because sometimes the loudest statements aren't shouted into microphones. They're made in moments of stillness, when someone chooses to rise, even if no one else does. So if this moment reminded you that dignity still matters, that courage can look like a simple act of standing, share this video. Let this applause echo far beyond one hall, one day, one headline. Let it remind the world that principle isn't partisan, and respect isn't negotiable. Because in a time when outrage has become currency, choosing grace is rebellion. Choosing gratitude is power. And standing, even when you stand alone, is how change begins. So as the sound of that applause fades into memory, remember this. Every time someone stands for what's right, America stands a little taller too. Because sometimes the loudest statements that are made in silence, and then followed by a standing ovation.